Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this Powermate generator. This one was found on Facebook Marketplace by Ken of Ken's Small Engine, and he picked it up for me. He actually talked the guy down to 80 bucks, which is a great deal. Even if this ends up being a parts machine, at 80 bucks, you can't go wrong. That said though, I am a little suspicious of it because there is no pull cord. The description on the listing said this is a great little generator. It just needs a set of wheels, a pull cord, and it's leaking fuel. And it is definitely leaking fuel. When I picked it up from Ken's, there was a puddle under the machine. It leaked in my car on the way home, and it leaked overnight on this cardboard in my garage. And actually, since I got it up on the lift, it continues to leak, but not from the carburetor. It's actually leaking over here. You can just get a glimpse of it right there. And when you look up, the oil fill is right there. And I believe that is where it's coming from. So that actually smells like fuel with maybe a little bit of oil mixed in it. So I'm thinking there is a very good chance that the engine is flooded with gasoline. So I think I'm going to start there. So let me set up a little bit better and get going on this. So what do you think? I think we're going to have a gusher here in a second. Okay, not as bad as I thought, but you can see by how thin this is. That is mostly fuel. So yeah, not a good thing. Let's pull the plug and get that drained out. Probably the fastest oil change I've ever done. So, we know the crankcase is probably nice and clean. So I'll let that drip for a second, and we'll actually put some oil in the engine. And there's a look at what came out. So, yeah, it's mostly fuel, maybe just a tiny bit of oil. So, that can only happen when the carb is not stopping the flow of fuel. This is gravity fed. Likely someone left the valve open. And if the needle's not holding the fuel back, the fuel has to go somewhere. It's either going to come out the front through the airbox or go into the piston area and seep down into the block. So yeah, the carb for sure we're going to have to take a look at. But for now, let's just get some oil in it. And I'm thinking next, let's get the starter recoil off and just make sure the engine rotates and has compression. Actually, I'm noticing the fuel valve is actually on. So we'll shut that off, knowing what we know about the carburetor. And there's also a good chance, actually, that the cylinder might be full of fuel. So, if the engine doesn't rotate, we probably need to pull the plug and get the fuel out of the cylinder. Interesting. Got a 10 millimeter head, an 8, and an 8. So, yeah, someone's been in here mixing and matching. Guess we'll do the 10 first. And the rope, it's just completely missing. It's not like it broke and someone didn't replace it. It actually broke. Someone came in here and took what remained. Anyway, the recoil itself, I think, does work. And the engine's not stuck. And we have compression. Pretty good compression, too, I'd say. Good. Definitely a little noisy. So I don't know if that's rod knock or not. You know, a lot of times Honda clones sound like that when the engine's not running. And they actually sound fine when running. So I'm hoping that'll be the case here. And I've got to imagine, too, a lot of the components likely don't have oil on it. You know, a lot of that might have been washed off by the fuel. So we'll wind this up pretty much all the way. Which is right about there. And the rope goes in there. We just have to align that with the hole on the inner part, which is right there. And we'll hold that in place. And I'm going to try to use the number 5 cord. I'm not sure what would have been in there originally, but I think this will be fine for this size engine. It's right there, but it's not going through, so number 5 might be too big, although I say that. And now it comes through. And you may have noticed there is a drip coming from up above here. It's actually coming from this handle tube. There is a hole in it. So I'm guessing there's water in here. When I tip this up, you know, that's allowing some of it to drip out. So I'm thinking we should have a peek in here. We know the carb's getting fuel, and the needle and seat aren't working, but potentially the carb might be able to run the engine. The air filter looks good. So, yeah, let's give it a few pulls, see what we get. All right, let's give this a try. I've got a light plugged in and turned on in the event that it starts. The choke's already on. I'm going to leave the fuel off. You know, there should be fuel in the bowl. So we'll turn the ignition on. I didn't think this thing was going to start, but not only did it start, it started first pull. Now, granted, the carb, it has issues. I had a lot of trouble getting the engine to run smooth, but the good news is the engine sounds healthy. I don't hear any knocking, and the generator is making power. So I spent a second and tried to bring the speed up, which I did, but I had to max out the adjustment. So something isn't quite right. I think we are going to have to dig into that, but we were able to get up to about 61.5 Hertz. So overall, I'm pretty impressed. So before dealing with that carb or the governor linkage issue, I actually want to get probably the tank out of the way. It is pretty full of fuel. The fuel doesn't smell fresh. Doesn't smell bad either. It's somewhere in between. So I think we should drain that out to be safe. We'll move the tank out of the way, and that'll give us a much better view of the governor to see if there's any issues there. And actually, let's have a look in the tank. I haven't taken a look in here yet. Cap looks pretty good. And the tank appears to be rust-free, so that is good news. I'm going to get the airbox off. It's kind of in the way. I just want to pull this line and drain the tank through that. I didn't even see that. There's a clamp on there. It's rusted up, and actually one of the tabs is broken off, so I can't squeeze it to release the tension. Anyway, I think you get the idea. This is going to take a while. There is a lot of fuel in the tank, but we do have good flow. The fuel that's coming out doesn't look that bad. There is no debris. There's no water contamination. And although the fuel isn't fresh, it can definitely be reused. To get the tank off, there's just a bolt in each corner. But once those are out, we still can't get the tank out because the control panel is in the way. So we're going to have to remove those bolts as well. That should allow us to move this a little bit out of the way, hopefully giving us the clearance we need to get the tank off the machine. Now this gives us a much better view kind of what's going on here. So I see a couple problems. Actually, the anti-surge spring is broken. I would say it rusted away. So all that surging we were seeing earlier could be as simple as replacing this spring. As far as the adjuster goes, it is maxed out. So we could either get a longer screw to potentially put a little more spring pressure on there, but I'm also noticing that the governor spring, it is rusty, and when they rust up, they tend to lose a bit of their spring tension. So yeah, before cleaning the carb, which we're going to have to do anyway, I'm thinking, let's get the broken anti-surge spring replaced. We'll put a new governor spring on here, and we'll get it restarted. See what kind of difference that makes. So I'm giving you the bird's eye view here. And I'm going to start by just taking the tension off of the governor spring. So with that tension off, it'll make it easier to remove and swap that out. Although this is a little sticky, so let me get some penetrating oil on there. So we'll give this one a try. This kit comes with all the components needed. And it's just a generic kit for a Honda clone, or even a Honda. So this is the spring here that we're after. And they are similar, but actually the new one is a little bit longer, and that could be problematic. So yeah, let me double check, see if I have anything a little bit better match. So I don't have one that's a better match, but I do have this other one. This is a used one. Also has a bit of rust, but the total length is less, actually by about 1/4 inch. So that might actually be a good thing. That way we don't have to max out the adjuster. So I'm thinking we should give this one a try. And for the anti-surge spring, we just need to slide the carb forward and remove the linkage. And we can slide that old spring out. And put the new spring on. Now this spring isn't super critical as far as, does the length have to be the same or the spring tension the same? As long as it's applying a force to keep this from happening. I don't know if you can see that, but that governor rod has slop, and it has slop on the other side. So the spring holds these two together so that you don't get that play, which can definitely cause surging. Okay, that feels pretty good. I'm sure the engine's going to run slow, which is fine. So I'm going to get the carb bolted back down, feed it some fuel, and we'll try to start it again, see what happens. So I just topped off the carb with fuel, and surprisingly, the needle seems to be holding. Or if it is leaking, it's extremely slow. Anyway, let's try to start it, see if it runs any better. So ignition's on, choke is on, and assuming it starts, it's going to run slow. I didn't put enough spring tension on, so we'll try to bring that up to 61.5 Hertz. Yeah, unfortunately, adding that anti-surge spring did not fix the surging. It is surging pretty bad. You know, the choke was on almost 100% to get things to smooth out. So we definitely need to go through that carb. But swapping out the governor spring did fix that issue. We got up to 61.5 Hertz, and we have plenty of adjustment left. So let's get the carb off and get it cleaned up. So I don't think this one's going to be too bad, even though it looks pretty bad from the outside. You know, it at least runs, and oddly enough, the needle and seat seem to be working, which is a bit perplexing, but I guess, you know, it could have been some debris just caught in there holding it open. You know, if someone didn't shut off the fuel valve, then it doesn't take much to flood out and cause the issue that we saw in the crankcase. But, you know, so far things are looking very clean on the inside. And yeah, that bowl is almost spotless. You know, a bit of debris on the bottom, but not too bad. The pin is not stuck. And the needle looks pretty decent. So no concerns so far. Let's see if that main jet will come out. Yep. And there's the emulsion tube. And lastly, we have the pilot circuit, which that is what I suspect is clogged. You know, right now we're running the machine under no load, so the main jet isn't really coming into play. You know, until that throttle plate opens up to support a load, you know, it's mostly the pilot circuit. So I'm actually going to spray this down with some carb spray before pulling that out. I don't want to get any of this dirt into the pilot circuit. Yeah, it's hard to tell, but it does kind of look clogged. So let's run through that. We'll run through all the passages, make sure they're clear, and then we'll give this a good soak in the ultrasonic. Yeah, I don't think that was clogged. Went right through. There's also some passages here on the side of the throat, and those are the pilot circuit. There's one actually in front of the throttle plate, and then there's usually about 3 kind of behind the throttle plate once it starts to open. So we'll make sure those are clear. So it is a little bit concerning. The main jet, the pilot jet, neither were clogged. You know, those little holes in the throat of the carb are also not clogged. So there could be an internal blockage. Not sure. But hopefully the ultrasonic can take care of it. Well, the carb did clean up really nice. That said, though, my confidence is kind of low on this one because I did not find any blockage. You know, aside from a bit of debris in the bowl and just a tiny bit of water, you know, there was nothing else wrong with this carburetor. So, you know, I'm hoping it's going to run better, but I'm not so sure it is. Okay, so let's get this bolted back on and give it a go. All right, the carb's been refueled. Needle and seat seem to be holding. So hopefully this time after we start it, we can turn that choke off. Now, without the airbox, it may not run perfect, but the last time we had it running, the choke was almost 100% on. So I'm hoping we can do a little bit better this time. Yeah, and there's absolutely no difference. So even though the carb is spotless, both inside and out, I can't turn that choke off more than about 10%, and that's not good. So either we have a massive air leak here on the insulator, which, I looked it over, I didn't see any problems, or we just have issues with this carb. So I think I have a new clone carb that will bolt on here. So I'm going to pull this one off. We'll put a brand new one on and see if it runs any better. So what do you think? Brand new carb? Is it going to run better? I hope so. Anyway, we've been refueled. We'll get the choke on, get the engine started. Very interesting. So a brand new carburetor runs the engine exactly the same way. I had to choke it almost all the way to get the engine to smooth out. So we are running lean, and it does seem to be a fuel problem, but the carburetor, I don't think is the issue. So I'm going to switch back to the original carburetor, but first I am going to drill out this pilot jet. I just double checked it. It comes in at a 78 micro drill bit, and I commonly do have to drill these out to about 75. So that's what I have in here right now, number 75 micro drill bit. Will that do it? It might. I've had quite a few machines that surge badly, and they require, opening this up just a few sizes. And we're through. That actually did not take a whole lot of effort. Yeah. So I'm going to get this reinstalled in the carb. We'll get the original carb back on, and we'll try it again. I've got the original carb refitted with the drilled out pilot jet. Let's try it again. I'd say the surging issue is solved. This time I could turn the choke off fully and the engine ran nice and smooth. And I guess the big question is, why did we have to drill that out? And that answer I can't say for sure. What I can say is that these carbs are jetted extremely lean from the factory, and potentially it's been surging like that since new. The only other possibility is an air leak between the carburetor and the engine, but I don't think we had one. I did pull the insulator. I inspected it very thoroughly. I did not find any cracks or imperfections, and I even sprayed around this area with carb spray looking for a leak and couldn't find it. So now that this has been modified, I think carburation we can cross off the list. So I'm going to get the airbox back on, and I think before going any further, I do want to get this outside and just clean up some of this mess before finishing this up. It's very important to put the choke on first because the airbox is what holds it in place. So you cannot put this on after the fact. So the last big thing here is just adding some wheels and feet. And the wheels, I think, are the easy part. I do have a set of Predator wheels that fit pretty much perfectly right on. But the problem here is the feet. I do have one or two options here to pick from, but they're pretty long. And the way this generator is set up, it's actually set up so that the frame rides really close to the ground, and I need some feet that are equally short. So I don't have anything here that would match these wheels, but I think I do in the storage locker. So let's take a trip out there and grab what we need, and hopefully that fixes this problem. So these are my best chance right here. These are Powermate generators, just like the one we're working on, except these are the larger version. They also have larger wheels. Those are 12-inch wheels. And these also ride close to the ground, and they have some pretty small little feet holding them up front. So I think these are the best chance we have. So let's grab a set of these feet. We'll bring them back and see if they have any chance of working on that other machine. So before we commit and install the push nut, I'm going to temporarily get these wheels attached. I want to roll this off the dolly. We'll get those feet temporarily set in on the front and just make sure everything's going to sit nice and level. Graceful. I think that looks pretty good. We are sitting nice and level. But there is a catch, though. I did have to remove the rubber foot. So right now, we are just sitting on the plastic pedestal. So to correct that issue, to add this back, we'd have to swap to a bigger wheel. Right now, these are 8-inch wheels. We would need a 10-inch. And that is something I don't have. So I'm thinking the easiest thing to do here might be to cut the plastic, by the thickness of this foot. And that will allow us to use both the rubber part on the bottom, the plastic part on the top, and that should solve our problem. All right, let's see what this thing can do. Now, according to the sticker, it is rated at 3,250 watts. So we're going to put 3,000 watts of load on using the load bank. And once you factor in the 100-watt light and the fact that the cooling fans inside of the load bank use about 150 watts, that's going to bring us right up to its limit of 3,250. So let's get the engine started and put it to the test. So the engine, it started right up, no issues there, but it is still running a little bit weird. You can kind of see it in the light, that power is fluctuating, and you can hear it as well in the exhaust. It's not quite right. So I'm going to apply a little bit of choke just to see if that improves the situation at all. And no, it actually makes it worse. So let's bring on a load and see if it gets any better. But before we do that, let's see where we're starting at. So without a load, we're at about 6% THD, and the sine wave looks pretty typical. So let's start with about a half load of 1500 watts. Yeah, no issues. Actually, the engine sounds quite a bit better. Although still not completely stable. I see that needle fluctuating a bit. Actually a lot. THD under a half load went up to 23%. And the sine wave does not look very good. But it is doing it. Of course, as I say that, it starts to fluctuate. So I'm wondering if it's starving for gas. Kind of what's going on here. Anyway, let's give this a few minutes and see if there's any surprises. Well, it's been a few minutes and really nothing has changed. It's handling the load without issue. But the engine's definitely fluctuating between running smooth and a slight surge, like it is right now. So let's try applying a little bit of choke again with a half load to see if that makes any difference. And yeah, actually that does make a little bit of a difference. So we have the choke on just a little bit. It seems like that issue has sorted itself out. So let's bring up the load a little more. Although I say that, and it is still fluctuating. So actually adding that partial choke didn't really fix the situation. Might have made it a little bit better. So the choke is back off. It's definitely not quite as happy. And you can see that right here in the gauge as well. So let's bring the load up to 2000 watts. And actually that's running quite well. Almost perfect. Let's try 2500. No issues. How about 3000? Yeah, I didn't like that. Let's try it again. No. Definitely cannot do 3000 watts. So right now we're pulling 2500 watts plus another 250. So we're short by about 500 watts. Anyway, at almost half load, we're at 27% THD and the sine wave, yeah, looks about the same as half load. So we'll give this a few minutes and then we'll shut things down. Well, it's been a few minutes, and it seems to be doing it. You know, we just can't go any higher than where we are right now. So I'm going to take the load off, We'll let things cool down, and then we'll shut it down. So not exactly the results I was hoping for. We are down a bit on horsepower, and more concerningly, the engine's not running stable. It is surging or hunting a bit. So, I think we've ruled out carburation. We did try another carb. We did have to adjust the jetting on this one, but even when applying partial choke, although it improves a bit, it doesn't go away. It is still there. So I actually just double checked my video footage and realized that the governor spring, the replacement one, I didn't install it in the same hole as the original, and I actually moved it further out. So like that, it should be less sensitive to surging and actually less responsive to a load. And this actually performed very well. From no load to 2,700 watts, the engine speed barely changed at all. So I'm not sure moving that spring back to the original position is really going to help improve things. But at this point, it's really the only thing I can try. So I'm going to get these bolts back off. We'll probably just get the tank out of the way. We'll make that adjustment and try this again. So moving that governor spring didn't fix the problem. I'd say if anything, it made it worse. So I'm thinking, let's check the valves. We haven't done that. And this engine has close to 600 hours on it. So if a valve is tight, potentially that could cause some of the issues we're seeing here. All right, so I'm going to rotate the engine until one of the valves is fully open, and then we'll check the other. So the gasket that came out doesn't look great. Potentially someone's been in here before, so that gives me hope that maybe they adjusted it wrong, although the intake feels pretty good. Actually, that's pretty loose. That's a 4/1000 right there, and it just went right in with pretty much no drag. So let's try a 6. Same thing, so that is a pretty big gap. Let's try a 10. Yeah, 10 fits too. I'd say that is kind of loose. Let's try a 12. Huh. 12 is loose too. So, I'm not sure we need to go much further. The intake is clearly out of spec, but I am curious to see how much it is out of spec. So I'm going to keep going. This is a 15. Yeah, it actually feels like a 15. So that is way out of spec. The intake, I'd have to look up on this machine, but I'd say it's likely supposed to be 4/1000. So let's rotate the engine over. We'll do the same check on the exhaust. So we'll start with the 6/1000. Yeah, loose, absolutely no drag. So let's jump ahead to the 10. Maybe a little drag at 10. So the exhaust is definitely out of spec as well. Let's try a 12. Yeah, 12 is getting close. It's probably a 13, and I'd say it's supposed to be a 6. So both of these valves, they are way out of spec. So let's make some adjustments, and we'll try this again. So I don't have the specs on this engine. I haven't looked them up, but I'm willing to bet Powermate probably doesn't publish them. So I'm going to go with 4 on the intake, 6 on the exhaust. I think that's pretty standard for these engines. Yeah, that one feels pretty good at 6. Yeah, a 7 fits as well, but it's on the tight side. So I would say the exhaust is good. Let's rotate the engine over, make the adjustment on the intake. That feels good. And we'll get a new gasket installed. That's what it's supposed to look like. You can see the one that got pulled out of there was missing pretty much every single corner. And when looking on the bottom side of the valve cover, those corners aren't there. So someone definitely made the adjustment and, of course, did it in such a way that it was way off. So I don't know if this is going to help, but it's definitely better than it was before. So we'll get this back on. I think I'm going to put the governor spring also back to where it was. And we'll get this started again. And yeah, pretty much no change in the way the engine sounds, even after adjusting the valves. So I'm kind of running out of options here. And I guess the next obvious and easy thing to try is a new plug. So let's get that swapped out and we'll try it one more time. Plug wasn't too tight in there, which they don't have to be, but usually from the factory they are. So likely this plug has been swapped out at some point. And I wouldn't say it's spinning out the best, but it is coming out. Okay, and we've actually got an Autolite plug, which I don't see very often in a generator. It is just labeled 63. That is the only number here. So I'm not sure if that is the correct plug for a Honda clone like this. Usually they either have a torch or an NGK, BPR 6ES. So that's what I'm going to put in. It's already gapped properly. Okay, let's try that out. Yeah, unfortunately, making all those changes didn't seem to make any improvements as far as the engine stability goes. You know, the governor, it's just bouncing around. It's just like a very quick oscillation, which I haven't really seen that before, so I'm not really sure kind of where to go from here. But I do want to redo the load test and just see if we picked up any horsepower. So with the fans on and the light, we're at 250 watts. We'll add 2,000 into the mix. No issues. The engine actually sounds really good under load, but it is fluctuating a bit. Let's try 3,000. Nope. Can't do 3,000. How about 2,500? Yep. 3,000. No. It doesn't have the horsepower. Well, I think we can cross spark plug off the list because it's running exactly the same way. And even though we have a new plug and adjusted the valves, it can't handle any more load than it did before we did any of that. So yeah, I'm kind of running out of ideas as far as what this can be. You know, the governor spring, it's back in the outmost position, so that should make the governor less responsive and less likely to surge. But we do have a very quick surge, you know, a high frequency surge, and I'm not quite sure what is causing that, but adding choke doesn't get rid of it. And I don't think we have engine problems either, because when I pull the engine over, you know, the compression feels pretty good and the leak down is actually minimal. So I think, you know, likely the engine is actually in good shape. And I guess the one thing I am suspicious of is the insulator between the carburetor and the engine. that would explain the severe surging that we had back in the beginning. So although I didn't see a problem with it, I'm thinking we should swap that out just as a last ditch effort. Oh yeah, and to make matters worse, the new gasket I put on the valve cover seems to be leaking. So I just torqued this down properly, so hopefully that stops that new problem. That gasket looks to be good, so I'm going to leave good enough alone. I think I may have met my match on this one. It's not really clear what's wrong with this engine. The valves are now in spec. We have a new plug. We've gone through the carburetor, made some adjustments there, and we've pretty much ruled out anything and everything that I can think of on this machine. I guess the only other thing that comes to mind is potentially the generator itself. When the engine is doing that surge, the light intensity, the voltage is changing. Like I can see it in the light. So, maybe there's a problem with the AVR and it's just putting quick, sudden loads on the engine, and that's why we're getting what we're getting. So I guess as the absolute last thing I'm going to try here is just unplug the AVR. We get the engine restarted and see if that makes any kind of a noticeable difference. And unfortunately, disabling that generator had no effect as well. So the generator, I would say, is not the problem. It has to be an engine problem. And at this point, I am fresh out of ideas. Anything else I try here is just going to be a guess in the dark. So I'm going to turn it over to the comments section. I want you guys to give me some ideas as to what the run issue is on this engine. Either way, at the end of the day, this is running better, but we're not quite there yet. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.